So title panel is bridging sucks, and I just roped in all these three people here to talk about bridges. I got asked, do I have some predefined questions for a panel? And that's not how I do panels. I'm interested in discussion. Maybe we could start with still a classic way of doing panels, so a round of short introductions. Please don't fully show your project, but quickly, maybe a bit what you did in the past, and then what are you doing now, or what the project you're working for or founded is doing now.
Sweet. So my name's Simon. I'm the founder of Chainflip. We're building what we have built a cross-chain DEX. We do like B2C to ETH swaps and Solana and Polkadot and various other things using threshold signature schemes and our own AMM. I'm sure we'll get into a bit of that later. Before this, I built a secure messaging app called Session. It's now got about 800,000 monthly active users. Pretty cool. I live here in Berlin. It's really good to see all five of you here today. Thanks very much for coming. Over to you.
My name is Odysseas. I was working Nomad at Brew. So naturally I do security now. So we're building security tools because we think that crypto should be as safe as TradFi. And the idea is that if you build a tool in a very intuitive and easy way, then everyone will use it. And we can actually make my mom use crypto, because right now, even if it would be easy to use, I wouldn't allow her to use it because hacks. So that's for me.
Hey, I'm Dominik. I'm the head of ecosystem at LIFI. We are a bridge and DEX aggregation protocol powering a lot of applications and wallets through our SDK and API. Before that, I founded an isolated lending protocol, and before that, I was working on a smaller project that was also doing cross-chain bridging.
So we can start with an easy question. What is a bridge?
I think that really depends who you ask. I'm pretty sure all of us would have a slightly different answer as to what constitutes a bridge. I mean, we sort of do bridging in the sense that we allow users to move value from one chain to another, but it's actually a DEX as well, so you don't end up with the same asset you started with. Whereas I think a more traditional definition would be you want to move USDC from one chain to another, you end up with the same thing on the other end, but there's like a million different ways to skin this cat, and yeah, I think bridging in general is a fairly complex topic. When people are talking about the details as well, they get very caught up on the technicalities, but I always like to think about it from an application standpoint, like, what's the user actually trying to do? Whether it's a swap or a bridge, I think that's a pretty nice way to separate the two, but obviously they're usually pretty closely interlinked. Because if you're bridging something from one place to another, you're probably doing that to buy a meme coin or an NFT in another currency somewhere else. So, I think that's how I tackle the question.
For me, probably the best bridge that we have right now is Binance.
Yes.
So I think that's how I define a bridge. And then a lot of protocols are also what we say as like cross-chain messaging, which means that you want something on one chain to react to something that happened in another chain. So this is where I put the line.
Yeah, I think if you ask yourself that question, you have to kind of fundamentally ask yourself what the underlying problem is, and the underlying problem is that blockchains themselves are, you could either call them egocentric or blind. So basically they can just see their own database, they can just see their own state, right? So if you want to have either information or an asset or any other kind of state from that blockchain transferred to another blockchain, you need to come up with some mechanism to verify that across these different state machines. And there's multiple ways to do this. As Odysseas just said, it could be just a centralized entity that basically just gives its okay and does that. Or you look at something more decentralized, which is either based on maybe like an Oracle network or a message passing layer or some kind of a light client. So yeah, at the end of the day, the underlying bridge is just a way to verify messages across different chains, and that could be messages, you know, pertaining either to value or information.
So then I guess following up here, then like we've seen lots of like evolution on like what we think of as bridges, but also the technology surrounding it. Are there certain types, or I guess now we will maybe name a few categories in discussion, like some types or categories of bridges that you guys might say are defunct now, like they have been superseded by other types of technologies, or maybe certain types and then use cases for those that they're not useful anymore.
I mean, I wouldn't say not useful anymore, but there's obviously, you know, there's maybe cheaper ways to verify that information than others. And then there's also the question of like, how valuable is that information, right? Like, how much effort do I have to put into like programming over that information from one place to another? If it's very low value information, then I don't need to use the most, you know, computationally expensive way of doing that. I can use something cheaper, and you know, if I, you know, use something more, if I want to bridge a lot of value, then maybe I need to use something like Chainflip, which has its own validator set, which, you know, uses the economic value of that validator set to, you know, basically guarantee for that information. Or as Odysseas said, you use Binance, which basically uses its reputation at the end of the day to do that. And I think that's the main question here, is like different tools for different problems.
I wouldn't say that, you know, Binance puts the reputation. It's put something much stronger, which is, you know, Binance exists in the society that's underpinned by a legal system. So, you know, I think that's where the trust assumption comes. And that's why I think, you know, for example, there are many validator reasons, right? Or basically you have, you know, what we said, a non-honest oracle. Because even if you had like validator nodes like Axelar, they can't verify if, you know, like for example in Axelar, you could have all the nodes colluding. They could like, you know, write value from one chain and they wouldn't be slashed by Axelar. Because there is no way for Axelar network to verify it. Yeah. So I think, you know, an interesting value proposition that I say in Wormhole, for example, is that, you know, it's a validator bridge, but it's run, you know, all the validators run by US institutions, and you know them, you can sue them if they do something. And actually, I think that's a very interesting realization I had, where, you know, we slowly move away from like this decentralization theater. We will try to be decentralized, but does it really matter? And is it worth it to add like immense complexity, like ZK lifetimes or whatever? Like, do you trust more the ZK circuits, not have bugs, than you trust, you know, like a US institution doing something fishy in a very opaque, in a very verifiable way? So I think it's as I think about bridges, I'm slowly aligning more and more centralized designs, where they're based on you know, legal system or whatever, because that trade-off allows you to have a much simpler system, and you know, a simpler system is by definition safer and more secure.
I think a really good point out on that is maybe a defunct technology that was once heralded as the way forward. Atomic swaps, for example, right? Like, I remember back in 2015, like, this is going to be the bomb.com, we're going to get rid of centralized exchanges and so on, but, you know, it just ended up being so, like, complex and unwieldy that it didn't get adopted at all, basically. And yeah, I think the numbers don't lie, right? All of the various bridges and aggregators and everything else, you know, the simpler and cheaper it is, people really don't care about the underlying technology, which is why Binance and the other centralized exchanges have had such a foothold. Because yeah, if you have to decide whether or not you're going to use something, and it's just very complex and hard to understand, where really what you're looking to do is like a 5-minute interaction with this protocol to achieve whatever effect you're looking to achieve. It's just not worth it, you know, and all of the technical overhead that comes along with it now. I think we're probably going to see a lot more styles of bridging fade away. I mean, we already kind of have. Like, I remember in 2020, the DeFi summer, right? If there was some other chain with some yield farming thing, someone would create a bridge, and then there'd be like 50 million of this token sitting in some wallet somewhere, so you could stake on, you know, Pepe chain or whatever the hell you want, like it was at the time, which obviously led to a lot of problems. But now that we've got, you know, USDC issued on so many chains now, the role of bridging is changing, the underlying technology has changed with it as well. So I think there are uses for all these technologies and approaches, but you know, I think numerically there's a much clearer case now for certain technologies that are coming forward.
So it seems like you all are kind of going towards this direction of like, yeah, okay, like, well, broadly speaking, that like trustlessness or decentralization is getting a lesser role, but can you say this still to the users of chains where still some of the top 10 assets are lock mint or burn mint bridge built assets?
Yeah, I mean,
these are still under like massive risks if the underlying technology is not decentralized.
Going back to the name of this panel, right, which is like bridging or why bridging sucks. The thing is people don't care about bridging or like how bridging happens and how their assets are secured until it becomes a problem, right? Like that's what we've seen time and time again is like users at the end of the day, and that's what we see at LIFI, right? Users just want cheap and fast, like, and they don't really care how that is done, and also depending on how these assets are issued on the chain. And maybe here we can talk about like different assets issued by different, you know, message passing bridges versus something like CCTP issued native assets. As long as you just go in and out of that asset and then you have a native asset on the chain, you don't care so much maybe. But let's say if you start holding, for example, a wormhole issued asset or an Axelar issued asset or whatever, and now something happens to that bridge, what we've seen, you know, with the whole multi-chain exploit and hundreds of millions of dollars of assets being issued by that bridge and then being able to be minted, and you know, similar thing that we've seen with the Nomad hack back in the day, then they start caring. So the problem is, at the end of the day, is like, who should care about how these assets get issued? Should it be the chain itself? Should it be the application using it? Or, you know, should the end user care? Which probably the end user should not care because it's like way too much complexity, because we need to sit on a panel and we're these supposed experts on this and discuss this for half an hour. So yeah, it's trade-offs all the way down, I would say.
I think an interesting note here is that even if you change to native assets, a bridge hack can take entire ecosystems down. So even if you have a native whatever, if that whatever is useless, then you have a native useless whatever. So I think it's, you know, the second and third order effects of these very complex systems. Like if an ecosystem, for example, depends on liquidity that comes from Ethereum, and this whole ecosystem is propped on this liquidity, even if you have the native assets there, when suddenly that, you know, all this value that was locked, like 60 million or whatever, becomes zero, then the whole ecosystem just goes down. Like there's no other way around it. So I think for my mental health at least, I'm not sure if like bridging is, I think the value proposition of bridging is less than what I think it used to be before, especially with roll-up bridges. You know, if you're in a roll-up, you shouldn't use another bridge. You should use the native bridge. So you don't have any new trust assumptions.
So all three of you are also in kind of in this bridging related space for a while, and also especially like on the more the people and partnerships and BD, but also on the technical side. But I do on the BD side, then just going on what you just said, we still see L1s launching. I think there's actually a new L1 that is very heavily memed, which is going to be launching majorly with USDC backed by a bridge, not the native asset. Like or in general, we see even Sui or Aptos where there's like 4 different USDCs. If it's, and then we also see actually some L2s that even are contemplating supporting non-natively bridged assets. Why is this happening? Is there something happening behind the scenes?
It's just incentives, right? If you launch a new L1, you've got to get TVL. If you don't have TVL, no one cares. And unless you can somehow curry favor with Circle to get USDC natively issued on day one, which, as far as I'm aware, has never happened ever, you have no choice but to accept this incredibly risky strategy of just relying on basically just random people issuing tons of US dollars on your chain to try and create enough liquidity on it so that there can be some activity. And if you can get past that initial adoption hurdle through some airdrop program, or there's no real applications happening here. Maybe you're base and you have a great meme coin on day one called Bold, and that's what kicks it off, But at the end of the day, as a bootstrapping challenge in the whole L1, L2 frenzy that's been going on the last several years, you just have no choice but to accept it and just pray that after 6 months, Circle's going to come in and save the day and delete these ridiculous wrap tokens that are fundamentally like an existential threat to the whole ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean also they played it really well. Circle did a really smart move by upgrading USDC to this basically new contract interface where they just let the message passing bridges come in and deploy some kind of version of USDC on their chain and basically make the layer 2s or layer 1s pick which messaging provider they want to work with. And then once there's enough adoption, they just come in and take over the contract. And I think that's even gonna increase now with Stargate launching V2 and the whole concept of Hydra chains, which is basically exactly that, where they deploy kind of a native version or a pre-native version of USDC on their chain. I obviously, for my job, I speak to all these layer 2s, and there's gonna be an immense number of layer 2s launching with these Hydra chains because they need to somehow bootstrap the initial TVL, the initial activity on the chain for anybody to want to deploy anything on it. And because there's so much competition between all these hundreds of layer 2s now, these bridging providers can basically dictate terms, right? Because if you cannot onboard onto the chain, and in a similar way, you will not have Binance support from day one, right? So you basically have no other choice than to go with these solutions and then show more providers and other people that there's enough, traction on your chain to deploy kind of the better versions of this. So yeah, the business development of the bridging space on the liquidity layer, on the messaging layer, on the aggregation layer, it's very cutthroat right now, and there's a lot of if you just look at any governance forum of any chain or any big application, whenever it comes to deploying a new asset somewhere, you see that 7 different message passing providers basically death matching themselves in a governance forum.
You want to add?
I had a thought, but I've been trying to trace it back for a while now.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how this liquidity play also contemplated. I've always been the most surprised though, or have the native bridge yet the support from these come to. But so are we really now? I feel like we're reaching some kind of consensus here that this lock mint, burn mint is dead. You have co-owned objects, and then you have direct swaps with messaging passing. Is this then just what we're going towards, or how do you see this?
What do you mean burn mint is dead? Because that's how USDC works.
It is burn mint at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's burn mint.
It is chill, yeah. It's just fully centralized.
Yeah, exactly. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah. True.
And also, like, it's interesting that, if we only had USDC, then we wouldn't probably have so many hacks because they can like blacklist addresses really quick. So, if you see the hacks, but the first thing the hacker does is to change all the USDC and USDT into DAG. So they can be blacklisted and then they can move it around. I think a very interesting design from my perspective is this no-sys hash key, where it's like a multi-sig between bridges. I think that's very interesting because, saying, oh, maybe layer 0 will rag me, improbable, but saying that layer 0 and wormhole and Axelar will rag me, that's like so highly improbable.
Like aggregate security.
Yeah. So, if I had to move $1 billion, I would use that, or an OTC counter. I know. I think that's a very interesting approach.
Yeah, I think jumping from that, and do you think?
Okay.
Yeah, it's just if you think about it that way, also it becomes kind of like Ethereum. It's basically message bridging. Basically, just become clients, kind of. And instead of relying on just one client, you basically can rely on multiple clients, and you can use a setup that uses multiple clients. The funny thing is that, like, for example, Layer 0 has also built that internally with the DVNs, right, where you can also compose your security, so you can compose your security and then compose another level of security on top of that. And that's, as I said, that's why at the end of the day it just comes down to the application builder. It comes down to, for example, the validator set of Chainflip could also just validate messages for other bridges and be used in that way. So at the end of the day, it just comes down to your personal preferences. And what I see is there's just not a lot of knowledge there. We have a lot of chains coming to us being like, please help us, tell us how to do this. But we obviously cannot get too opinionated about it because it's at the end of the day, it's just a choice of building that you make.
And I think sort of to switch topics a little bit, but we're talking about all these different security models, all of these different methods of achieving the same effect, and all of these different chains and bridging providers and everything else, all of which have a different interface, all of which have maintenance overhead as well. So you can't, you can be LIFI and you can try and do all of them, and you guys are doing a great job of that. But from what I've seen, if you want to bring all of this together and sort of take advantage of these different security models and whatever else, you just have to manage an increasing amount of complexity, and all of the protocols underneath are changing all the time. The token support, the chain support, the providers and the way those providers work, the API calls that are being made. There's just an incredible amount of engineering overhead, and I think that's been one of the main problems in the bridging space, actually. There's no standardization, and there's absolutely no incentive for there to be standardization either, because otherwise you then lose your edge or whatever. Which is a problem, because it means that it's really hard to have a large number of services where application builders can actually leverage these in a way that you really can move from one asset anywhere in the ecosystem into this asset on this particular chain to do this particular thing, because it's impossible. There's just way too many moving parts.
Yeah, I mean it's getting there's not gonna be, if you also talk about bridges and specialization and how fragmented that ecosystem is. Obviously for us as the top level aggregator, that's great because it strengthens our value proposition. For engineering teams, not so great because they need to deal with an insane amount of complexity and also homogenize an insane amount of complexity, wrap around 30 different APIs that, as you said, constantly get upgraded. But what we see more and more is there's specific bridges building in specific directions. Some of them are better at bridging native assets, for example, Chainflip, and that's their main goal, is to bridge native assets between different chains. Or make them swappable between different chains. And then you have other bridges that are very stablecoin focused. Then you have certain liquidity networks Across or Connects that are focused on building fast liquidity layers, basically giving kind of a pre-confirmation, almost acting like a roll-up on top of these chains. And then you have others like Layer 0 that more, or Stargate, that more actually go into a submit and burn direction. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a stack forming, but it's instead of just one winner, it's going to be many specialized, and we just call them solvers at this point because they're kind of like bridging solvers. They just specialize in certain things, and it's path dependencies, right? If you build a company and you see success in a certain vertical, obviously that's the vertical you follow because that's where the most revenue and growth for your company is. So you have kind of like similar how in biology you have like certain, you know, certain species moving into certain niches. And we're seeing the same thing with bridges because that's just what happens in business. You have specialization, and we're just too early in the stack. This just hasn't been around for long enough for us to have like a final state of this where it becomes more calm and people can just build on these stacks. And that's also maybe why we don't have, what we always discuss, where we don't have so many consumer applications yet, because the tech stack is just rapidly evolving all the time. So it's really hard to build consumer applications on a rapidly evolving tech stack.
I also think that part of the reason we don't have a lot of applications is that not a lot of people have actually spent time and think about cross-chain UX. There's a handful of teams that do that, and you know, like unifying your USDC across 5 different chains. How do you sell that? And maybe if I want to use my USDC on one chain, it would automatically solve, as you said, you know, the best route for this USDC to go to that to the destination chain. So I also think it's like, you know, it's part of that usual crypto problem where it's much just more fun to build infra and new chains, like this mental masturbation, than actually trying to solve problems such as, you know, security. I think is one main, but also like UX, like how all this information serves to the users, how they can understand it, do it, etc. I think it's much harder than building some, you know, cross-chain arbitrary new product.
Yeah, but also we just think about, like, sometimes when I try to explain to people what I'm doing and what we're doing, it's like, and you just tap your Apple Pay in, like, let's say you're in Paris and you tap your Apple Pay, but you're a German citizen with a German bank account, right? You just tap your thing and you just expect it to work. But actually the complexity of that transaction in the back end, like, it has to touch multiple payment providers in multiple countries, there has to be confirmations, there has to be people kind of like fronting that money and then banks settling that money at the end of the day. That whole mechanism of payments, even in Web 2, even in the real world, it's incredibly complex. But you just don't see that anymore because it has all been abstracted away, and we're not at the phase yet where it's all abstracted away. So it just looks like a mess. But this is how complex systems work at the end of the day.
So we're kind of building towards something TradFi has looked at it.
I mean, that's what we always do.
We're nearing the time. If one person in the audience has a question, there we'll put some time for it. Does anybody have a question? No? Scary time. Good, then we can end early and have some more time until the next speaker. Thank you guys for joining. Applause, please.